further insight and to set the context and explain why the two pieces of work that have been undertaken are important. Kate will then hand over to James and Ian to talk through that work in more detail and to go through some of the insights and outputs. And yeah, my last thing to say is that there'll be some questions and comments at the end, and we'll sort of try and run through that in a bit of a discursive sort of question and answer session. So, Kate, I'll hand over to you.
Thanks, John, and hello everyone. I'm really great to see so many people joining us for this next hour, and great to see a lot of familiar faces as well as people from outside of the region, so welcome. The Combined Authority in South Yorkshire and our partners have been working with Opus Independents and the Fifth Sector for about best part of 10 months now on two comprehensive and complementary studies to help build our evidence base and engagement base with culture and the creative industries in the region. And this is to inform us as Combined Authority, but also to help us as a set of authorities across the region in terms of really understanding the base that we're working from, but also how we better invest and make the case for as a region. Today's an opportunity to hear about the findings of those reports and studies, which are vital to help us in that pursuit and to help us make those investment and support decisions as we move forward. So it's this is the first time we've really put this data out in a more broad and public setting. So it's also helps my colleagues, Ian and James, in terms of testing the way they talk about it as well. So we really welcome comments, questions as well at the end, as John says. So great to be joined by James Locke and Ian Bennett, who I'm going to hand over to in a moment, who are going to present the findings. They've worked really closely with me, but also with all our partners across the region in preparing both the research and the recommendations. We're also indebted to all those participants who took part in this study, and without them, that would not have been possible. Their generosity and energy, and I know there'll be a number of people on the call today, but you know, they continue to be very much engaged and advocates with us. We will be publishing these reports in due course, so there will be an opportunity to have them in full in the next few months, and I'm sure any slides would be able to circulate to this group. I'm just looking at James and Ian. I'm sure that won't be a problem. So yeah, so we can do that afterwards. And I look forward to hearing more in the Q&A what comes up. So I'm going to hand over to James, if I may, who's going to take it from there. So thank you very much again for being here.
Thanks, Kate. And yeah, echo that. It's really great to be here, and I'm really grateful to have had the opportunity to take part in this work and speak to so many fantastic organisations and freelancers and people about the absolutely cracking work that they're doing at the moment. I'm going to share my screen in a moment. Me and Ian had a conversation about this webinar a couple of days ago, and we were discussing perhaps doing a little top-level summary that speaks across the two reports to begin, which we think kind of sets some of the frame here and would be useful. So I'll speak to a couple of slides of that, and then I'll pass over to Ian, and then Ian's going to speak to his report, and then I will follow afterwards and speak to the engagement work that Opus have done. Okay, so I'll share my screen now. Hopefully that is working. So yeah, we wanted to start here with a top-level summary which acknowledges the macro context that we're operating in, all of us in South Yorkshire. And that involves acknowledging that we do have an economic crisis in South Yorkshire, that crisis is largely informed by a productivity crisis, which itself is underpinned by a health and well-being crisis. And so within that, there's a desperate need to rebalance the economy here in the region. And that means, while acknowledging the importance of advanced manufacturing, also acknowledging that it can't address all the issues. And that's demonstrated by the repeated doubling down on the sector and the lack of discernible change in productivity, relative, of course, to regions who have invested more in cultural and creative activity and infrastructure. And within that, we think there is a need for a more sophisticated economic model which values knowledge intensity, not just GVA. And there's lots of research from the likes of Nesta that speak to the connection between creative inputs and productivity in other sectors. And that's one of the absolutely astonishing and wonderful things about the creative arts and heritage sector, is that it's porous and it impacts other areas of work. Within all of this as well is a need to recognise the importance of equality, diversity and inclusion as part of that productivity gap, and recognise that until we equip all communities and people to engage productively in the economy, we won't see that productivity gap addressed in a way that we would like. And so I think it's important to say that culture, arts and heritage has something unique to offer. And indeed, one of the things that's been coming strongly out of our work is the importance of innovation that comes from culture, arts and heritage, and how we could be more intentional in addressing the interdependence between the productivity crisis and the health and well-being crisis through that lens. I'm just going to slide show properly there. I've just realised that. Apologies. So innovations in culture, arts and heritage are often place-based, which of course is where the real change to people's lives happens, and where public investment often is centred as well. And we believe that symptomatic of the region's failure to value culture, arts and heritage holistically, we can speak more to that later, and consequently draw down investment, are these problems of equity, access to funding, visibility and inclusion within the sector that have been identified by respondents, in particularly the engagement work, but also in the economic mapping and modelling. And when we think about how we invest in the conditions of this porous and multidisciplinary sector, a few things pop out at top level, which I'll name now. Firstly, the importance of a clarity and commitment on South Yorkshire Mayoral Combined Authority's capacity, its level of investment and its purpose in brokering transformational change in and across the sector. The importance of visible and accessible leadership, that leadership is bold and encourages diversity and leadership from often underserved communities and people. The recognition that the type of work in this sector is often portfolio work, that it acquires skills and increase in earnings, and that it complements other roles as well, carer, parent. And if we look forward into the trends of society, we know that those things will become increasingly important. Cross-regional collaborations, really important, focusing on the relationships between people in the sector and applying a problem-solving lens to it. The importance of peer-to-peer mentoring within the sector and investing in the sector's expertise and the capacity for the sector to share learning through it. And underpinning all of this, perhaps, a bold set of narratives, not a slogan, but something that's informed by a plurality of the stories that come from the sector, which everyone can find common ground in. I hope that gives a sense of some of the top level thinking. I'm going to pass over to Ian now and stop sharing. And Ian, I think you're going to share your screen, so I'll stop there.
Yes, thanks. I need a mixing desk for this because we're moving between so many different sets of documents here. So bear with me a second whilst I try and make Teams do what Teams doesn't like to do and be flexible. Okay. Of course, it's asking me to update Teams. Bear with me a sec. All right, I'm going to have to, I hope this is going to work. Sorry about this. I've got misbehaving Teams. I'm going to have to do this another way around. So this is the perils of doing these meetings on Teams are you can't actually get Teams to share the things that you want to share. So whilst I'm trying to find the document and move between three things, the first thing I would say is that very often creative industry is seen as occupying some silo by itself and not contributing more generally to economic well-being in the wider sense. And I have a lovely table which demonstrates that, which just doesn't want to share in any shape.
Ian, would it be helpful if you send it through to me and I'll try and present? Oh no, there we go. There we go.
It's got it finally. Okay.
That's me sharing in, just so you know.
Thank you. Do you want to zoom it out a bit? Thanks. Sorry, my Teams, as soon as I got on the Teams, it said please update Teams, which is meaning it's not. So what this table is demonstrating is the relationship of creative industries to the main themes of the strategic economic plan for South Yorkshire. And in fact, on this red line here, which is the space for what we hope will be the combined creative industries, culture, arts and heritage plan, I could have put all in practically all those boxes, but I just thought that looked too generic. But if we look at those, seven priorities across the set, culture and creative industries has got a contribution to make in all of these areas. It's a sector that's built on collaboration. It's about that ambition for creative South Yorkshire. And as James was stressing, it feeds into healthy communities. The innovation approach that's taken by creative industries is quite distinctive, as the presentation will show you. And this is all about inculcating greater knowledge intensity within the whole ecosystem and putting creative industries into the supply chain for other industries and growth as well. Obviously, creative industries as a knowledge intensive sector is deeply reliant on a really solid basis of skills and clear skills pathways for people to enter into, with an understanding of what the opportunities look like at the other end of those pathways. So attainment and progression is critical in this, and also that sense of health and well-being that comes from succeeding in these areas in order to be able to match supply and demand. We have in the creative industries, as in most industries at the moment, an undersupply of a critical undersupply of some skills, which is in itself holding back growth in the sector, and one in which South Yorkshire could definitely play a part, not just for employment within South Yorkshire, but for employment for South Yorkshire residents across the wider north. The clean energy and net zero bit, I've been kind and just said sustainability, but obviously innovation around sustainable working practices is something that creative industries is very invested in. One of the points that came out repeatedly, both in James's work and in ours, was the point that the areas I hate to say this for a mayoral combined authority which sprang from a transport authority, but the area is poorly served in terms of transport. So that recognises a kind of hub and spoke approach, but trying to get between different spokes in order to access opportunities, both for cultural engagement and for employment, is really difficult, both in the way that those routes are planned, their frequency, and their capacity. The digital revolution and the creative industries revolution are very much intertwined, that their innovations drive one another. It's not the case that tech leads and creative follows. One pulls the other forward, and there's a slingshot effect as they wrap around each other. So the digital infrastructure investment that has been taking place and the recognition of the digital economy also needs to take account of the role of creativity in new services, new products, and new forms of engagement. And lastly, in the land, housing and built environment space, I've focused on the strengthening of urban centres. That's not to say that creative industries is specifically urban focused, but it has got a recognised capacity to bring demand to new urban stronger urban centres. I'm not ignoring the natural heritage of South Yorkshire as a massive asset. I just think the contribution of creative industries is more in those cities. The blue lines underneath that relate to the Arts Council's strategy for the next 10 years, and they just highlight the opportunities for investment. So there are two ways in which it aligns. One with Arts Council's strategic objectives, which are cultural communities, which is CC on this box, creative people, which is people's ability to contribute themselves and benefit from creative industries. Julie, there's a skills mapping piece coming up in the slides to follow, and a cultural and creative country, which is the economic capacity of the UK to express itself in international markets through creativity. The Arts Council strategy also recognises some investment principles which need to underpin any of its investments, in particular inclusivity, which is the IR box. So that sense of increasing diversity is critical for securing Arts Council investment, but also there are other investment principles around ambition and quality, which relates to the nature of the work, dynamism, which is the resilience of the business models that creative businesses and cultural organisations are employing, and environmental responsibility. What isn't here yet and Sheffield's dropped off the bottom of that chart, but it should be on there, are how this intersects with the local economic plans which are in development at the moment. And the other line which would be there had we the space would be the relationship of work in the creative industries to the scale-up work that's already happening elsewhere in the sector. So in fact, James and Kate and I are engaged in a sort of task force at the moment, which is looking specifically at how we boost scale-up within the sector in order to achieve those outcomes. So I'm going to have another go at trying to make OneDrive behave for me in terms of where we're going. I think you might just have done it. I can breathe again. Can everybody see that on their screens now?
Yes.
Yes.
Great, fantastic. Okay. So I'll start by looking at the mapping data, the basic mapping data around creative employment in the workforce. So this is the official picture. This is the Office of National Statistics' most recent data on employment in the creative industries. We should be expecting an update anytime soon, but of course, with everything else happening in Whitehall, that's quite likely to get delayed. But these figures relate to the situation almost exactly as we went into lockdown at the end of March 2020. And in the view of national government, the creative sector in South Yorkshire is made up overwhelmingly of IT businesses, with smaller contributions from creative services businesses and architecture and advertising, some film, TV and photography businesses, and other contributions in publishing and design. However, that doesn't actually reflect the picture on the ground. So what we've done in this is we've looked at LinkedIn as a way to better measure the sector. The reason for that being that there are some 200,000 people registered on LinkedIn in South Yorkshire, and that's therefore a much bigger sample than the one ONS is using for measuring it. And we group those activities in supply chains, which reflect consistent and interchangeable skills bases, basically. So you'll see when we come to the skills piece that these pathways around creative content, creative experiences, creative originals, creative services, and software are reflected in our skills pathway analysis quite deliberately, so we can map that. So just to quickly summarize, content is essentially IP at a distance. So it's film, television, video games, recorded music, things that you consume that you don't have to be physically present at the act of making. Experiences is the opposite. It's experiences that you have to be physically present at in order to engage with. So that can range from festivals to live music, to museums, galleries, performing arts, theatre, dance, and even public art. The original section is the takeaway, the physical aspect of making. So fine arts and visual arts, crafts and jewellery, fashion design, and makers. The services sector is what it says. It's professional services with a huge creative element. So advertising, marketing, PR, architecture, graphic design, and design consultancy. And then the software section, we're looking at two things here, but which are software which is created specifically for non-creative vertical markets, and also the emerging set of new technologies which take advantage of things like artificial intelligence and machine learning. This isn't about the backbone, the digital backbone infrastructure. It's not data centers, it's not telecoms networks. This is the creative act of product development and software development. So if you remember the ONS picture of 13,500 people, we now identified 31,500 people across South Yorkshire. And yes, there are a large number of people working specifically in software within that, but it's not more than half of the sector. It's about a third. We've got significant contributions in creative services, which anybody who's familiar with the sort of advertising and marketing sector of the region would acknowledge. There are a lot of people making stuff, which again speaks to the legacy of the place. There are significant numbers making film, video, music content, and this group and experiences is probably an underestimate because some of those people are actually council employees and don't necessarily have LinkedIn profiles. And to Paula's point about the writing, yes, actually, since we've done this survey, LinkedIn has updated its industry categories to include writing and editing. So this isn't representing that, but it's possible that a further iteration of this might. So the way that we do that through LinkedIn, to answer Matthew's question, is that we use those industry codes which were on the other slide, and we combine that with a postcode view, which looks like this. To make sure that we're capturing locations within South Yorkshire. Now, I don't pretend that this is a comprehensive picture. It picks up more freelancers and it picks up more micro businesses, but there will still be people in the sector who don't have a LinkedIn profile. But as a baseline, you can see it's far more inclusive than the national statistics. So on the business side, there's a similar profusion of potential data sources that you can go to. And what we've done here is we've compared Companies House live data, which we passed through Bowhurst, with the Office of National Statistics records, which are publicly available on NOMIS Web, and the Mayoral Combined Authority's own FAME records. And again, what you see is there are actually more than 1,000 more businesses in South Yorkshire in the sector than recorded on ONS. And the main discrepancies in this are in areas including film and television, in music and performing arts, and in advertising and marketing. So there are discrepancies between each of the registers in each of those subsectors, but they're not equal. That the discrepancy isn't equal. So it's pretty clear, actually, that where the sector is growing is where there's the greatest discrepancy between the Companies House live record and what's currently in the national stats, if that makes sense. This, it's quite hard to see on the screen, I know, but this reflects the physical distribution of those businesses. Creative businesses are concentrated in towns and city centres and in the suburbs immediately around Sheffield, but they are represented in every single ward of the combined authority. When we analyse those businesses by the same supply chains as we looked at the workforce through, again, it makes it clear that software is a significant contributor to this, but there are many, many more. I'm trying to read Trevor's comments here because it's cutting out, so I might have to switch back to the chat. There are many more businesses in content and services than are reflected in the national statistics model. Trevor, do you just want to air that question? Because I couldn't actually see it as it flashed up in the chat.
I'm so sorry to have interrupted you. I didn't mean to. Just as an aside, that the subsectors where those discrepancies are showing in the previous slide are also those subsectors with, I think, from what I saw, more freelance, self-employed, atypical workers too. So I wonder if there's something about the read across there. That they're more difficult basically to map because of the workforce within them.
There definitely is something about that. It's baked into the structure of the creative industries that a lot of enterprises are actually single-purpose vehicles for projects and micro enterprises, and those two things mean that it's much more fast-moving. And obviously, annual national statistics sometimes struggle to pick that up. But yes, you're right. That reflects the fact that there's kind of greater velocity around those sectors as well. There's more activity and more constant change as well. It's not the kind of sector which recognises a steady state by its very nature. It's very much about innovation and project-based working. So that's a good way of reflecting it, actually. When we look at the and that's a perfect cue to my next slide, thank you, which is that when you look at the composition of the sector across South Yorkshire, what you observe is that the composition of the sector in Rotherham, Doncaster and Barnsley is pretty much similar. The difference is in Sheffield, which has a much higher proportion of content, experience and originals businesses. So in other words, that type of project-based activity in those sectors is agglomerated more around Sheffield, and you can see the effect of closer networking and better supply chain linkages in Sheffield compared with the other parts of the region. So what we can observe is that there's been a steady growth in the number of active registered businesses in creative industries over the past decade. So if we go back to about 2012, the number's around 1,500. We're now at nearly 3 times that. Interestingly, there was a spike in company formations that coincides exactly with the start of lockdown. And there are a number of reasons that may be advanced for that. One of them is people supported by furlough having time to pursue their side hustle. The second is people being laid off and actually making a decision to set up their own businesses. And there's also an inward migration element. We know that during the pandemic, lots of people left London and the southeast in search of more space, better living quality. And some of those people will have set up businesses where they landed in South Yorkshire. And again, that's reflected in the picture of company foundations between the 23rd of March, which is the day of the first lockdown, and the end of 2021. So there were 975 new company formations in the creative industries in South Yorkshire in that period. And again, what we can see through these is a subtle shift in the composition of the sector in South Yorkshire toward content and services. The proportion of new content and services businesses is higher than their proportion in the pre-existing business base, which is kind of interesting. And software's relatively still important, but not growing at the same pace. So if we come to look at economic impact, we have to use some imperfect lenses to this because we haven't yet been offered the opportunity to do the LinkedIn piece across the whole of the UK or to map all of the UK businesses, because that would be a massive undertaking. So what we've had to do for this is use the Office of National Statistics data as a proxy, because it provides us with sector outputs at a national level, and then work back through the clustering of businesses in South Yorkshire and their relative productivity, using the average for South Yorkshire productivity as a whole as a way of finding a conservative baseline. So that sector output of £860 million a year is extremely conservative on 3 different registers. It doesn't represent the number of businesses that we know are there. It doesn't represent the totality of the workforce, where there's a huge discrepancy. And we actually don't have any hard and fast figures for how the productivity of the creative industries in South Yorkshire relates to national productivity within that sector specifically. So they are about as conservative a set of estimates as you could possibly draw. There are lots of ways that in which you can see those would scale up, whether that's through looking at the relative proportion of the workforce, the relative number of companies, but there's also the multiplier effect that that's been recorded nationally for arts and culture, which is a GVA multiplier of 2.46 in the economy. In other words, for every pound that is made within a cultural and creative business, there's £2.50 generated elsewhere in the economy. So whichever way you look at this, however you choose to adjust these figures, I think it's reasonable to assume that the GVA of the creative industries in South Yorkshire is much nearer 2 billion than 1, and potentially much larger. When we look at the composition and the locations of the sector, again, we can only really do this using Office of the ONS data, because we don't have comparable data on a national basis. But it does highlight some things which come out of the other analyses. So the sense of a very strong service sector in Sheffield, particularly around architecture. This is the advertising and marketing, I think, is somewhat distorted by the extent to which that and digital are combined within the DCMS definitions. But design as a discipline, again, anything that's at a location quotient of 1 represents the average for the UK as a whole. In creative industries, it's extremely unusual outside London to find any cluster with a coefficient of 1, simply because so many of these businesses are concentrated in London and the southeast. So the ones which are above 1, which are highlighted in green, are very definitely clusters on a local and regional basis. And those that we've highlighted in orange are certainly clusters in the real sense of the word, locally. So there are clearly some areas where, I mean, I'm sure that people are surprised to see that IT software and computer services, for instance, doesn't represent a significant level of clustering anywhere within the mayoral combined authority area. But also that the proportion is slightly higher in Rotherham than it is in Sheffield. So there are lots of variations in there. However, how we understand this in terms of scale up is much, much trickier, because again, the composition and structure of the industry means that very many businesses are not working towards a 5-year plan, are not attracting private equity investment in the way that they work. They're working on a project-based basis, they're working collaboratively, and that means that the formal ways of measuring scale up, which this slide reflects, suggest that there's very little going on at scale up level. However, you then look at the macro picture for that, and as we've seen, there's been huge growth in the sector over the last decade. On a national basis, this has been the fastest growing sector of the UK economy for 2 decades now. So the question is, how do we square those two seemingly contradictory positions? And one way we can square that is by talking to the businesses themselves. This isn't my slide. I've nicked this slide from a presentation at the National Video Game Museum by a company based in the region, which has won lots of BAFTA awards for doing things in its own weird way. So State of Play makes video games by building sets, writing scripts, filming them, and then producing a video game from that film content, which is a very unusual way of doing it, but it's a very successful way of doing it for them. And as their own slide points out, they're not guided by a business plan for doing this. they're guided by the creative process of doing what they love. They accept that they're doing things weirdly, but that's the point for them to be doing it weirdly. They're doing it through collaboration. They're doing it through being flexible. In other words, they're not building a team of 50 people with private equity and then racing to hit a particular market objective. They will do small projects and collaborate with other makers whilst they're developing their own ideas, and their company size expands and contracts to meet that process. And then their sense of ambition isn't financially driven. It's about doing something new. Okay, so we'll get on to the skills point now. And as I said before, we've reflected the same pathways in the skills analysis that we reflected in the industry and workforce analysis, just to make it easier for people to see. So what that tells us is actually there's pretty good provision available in many sectors within South Yorkshire. There are 20 providers within the region offering a total of 510 courses whose creative element is the main aspect of it. So when we look at digital creative, those are courses which are looking at creative applications of digital technology. Again, this isn't IT and hardware based. This is about software development. We've included courses in wider Yorkshire for two reasons. One of them is many of them are as or more accessible in different parts of the region as the ones that are delivered within South Yorkshire itself. And also there's a proportion of online delivery and particularly in continuing professional development that is based outside of South Yorkshire, but accessible to individuals and businesses within it. And that's how the physical breakdown across Yorkshire looks in that sense. So, hello. We've lost the share again. Let's go back to that. Can you still see my slides?
Yes.
Okay, I'll go back to the slideshow and go back to the points that we were at. Oh, I did that all of a sudden. Probably Teams trying to update itself again. So the geographical spread. Leeds has more courses, but you'll see this orange bar here is the CPD. So that's very much influenced by the film and TV sector. Screen Yorkshire, which is based in Leeds, although its chief exec lives in Sheffield, has a large amount of delivery of CPD, which obviously has been in part inspired by the move of Channel 4, but pre-existed that was in fact a large part of the reason that Leeds was successful in securing that investment. You can see the teal bars here are the HE delivery. Again, Sheffield is clearly the strongest in that sense within South Yorkshire, not far behind Leeds regionally. But the FE delivery in places like Barnsley and Rotherham in particular is really interesting. Rotherham represents almost a complete pathway between levels 1 and 7 in some creative subjects, which is very, very unusual in a single local authority area. So there are some considerable strengths to build on there. What we probably need to understand better is where the demand for CPD is coming from and how we can best serve, how the local and regional FE and HE providers can best serve that. And obviously the things like T-levels, which are very new on the block, so aren't strongly represented in here. So what does that tell us? What that tells us is there's lots of good news, but still clustering productivity and diversity within the sector in Sheffield and South Yorkshire, well, particularly in Sheffield compared with the other M10 core cities, is lower. But there is an enduring legacy of independent music, film, design and digital creativity, which kind of exists almost separately from the city's cultural institutions in some senses. And understanding why that spirit of independence has both persisted but also maintained its separateness is something that the work on Scale Up is going to be looking at in more detail. We hope that this evidence is going to help those local authorities that haven't yet determined their plans to better align their strategic objectives in the way that the table that was set out at the start suggests. The data suggests that there are emerging specialisms in different areas of focus in each local authority area within South Yorkshire. So it's worth those local authorities doing that. I think the local authorities have already got all of these data, but I need to check with Kate about what the distribution of that looks like. But as James says, one of the important things here is mindshare. You know, West Yorkshire has recently committed £10.5 million to a 3-year plan for culture, heritage and sport. South Yorkshire needs to be communicating that it's serious about culture and creative industries, not only to reclaim that mindshare, but to get its share of the investment that follows that. Bad news is that equality, diversity and inclusion is really poorly served in the region. And we're comparing this with work we've done in places like Tees Valley, which aren't renowned for their diversity either. It's a serious worry in terms of whether we're still calling it levelling up this week or not, I don't know. But it's something that links the two pieces of work that James and I have done. So our recommendations, unsurprisingly, are do things weirdly. Celebrate those things, amplify those things, understand the independent, eclectic and experimental legacy of that collaborative working across sector boundaries and across disciplines. The second recommendation is that the authority needs to put some skin in the game, using sort of flexible interventions rather than stodgy ones, small grants to spur innovation, accepting collaboration, but also getting behind regional interventions which are proving successful. So we've mentioned Screen Yorkshire. There's also a Yorkshire-wide music launchpad, and signalling intent. The West Yorkshire funding is its kind of single part. It's the strategic determination of the mayor to commit that resource. And they've just published a 4-part plan, which is looking at people, skills, businesses and places. And I can go into more detail on that offline with anybody who's interested in that one. And the final one is the role of the combined authority to convene, lead and support this effort. So again, James referred to place-based policy. It needs to be specific. It needs to be nuanced. You can't throw a blanket across the whole region and just expect every place to respond in the same way. And one of the ways of making that more granular is to apply that lens of equality, diversity and inclusion, and also to continue to campaign for devolution of policy and funding to a regional and local level and away from Whitehall. Whitehall has got a terrible tendency to see any cluster of creative industries outside of London as just being a smaller version of that which is in London. And that's really not how the industry is structured. But there's a reluctance at policy level to accept that, and it's got to be driven home to them. I didn't see Julie's question re tourism and leisure, but it wasn't part of our brief. So with that, I'm going to drop off the share and hand back to James.
Thanks.
So I can't hear.
Oh, there we go. Okay, great. Thanks for that. Right, okay, I'm going to crack on and show some of the findings that we've received really from speaking to so many people across the region about arts, culture and heritage. Unfortunately, I can't see the chat, so John and Kate, if something crops up that needs attention, please do draw me to it. Okay. Great. Okay, so our work was really focused on speaking to as many different people as possible and asking them what their experiences were of the sector, where they might see improvement, and trying to align some of that thinking with the policy documents and research that's been done to date, all of which has been absolutely fantastic and really useful. The wider policy context we're operating in here, particularly the Strategic Economic Plan from South Yorkshire Mayoral Combined Authority. To realise our full potential, we need a transformational programme of investment in our cultural and creative assets. And underpinning some of that is, again, this identification of the importance of innovation in productivity and growth. Of course, Mayor Oliver Coppard coming out recently in his manifesto commitments to grow our economy and create good quality jobs, to establish a cultural forum, to be a proud cultural ambassador for South Yorkshire, to claim more funding, recognition and support. And I think all of the work that we've done today speaks to those ambitions. I wanted to just articulate some of the starting problems that brought us to this work. The effect of the pandemic, particularly on SMEs and freelancers. The fact that the region receives significantly less investment from public funders per head in comparison to other regions of comparable status. Two main concerns coming out of that from funders, a lack of investment in culture, arts and heritage by local authorities, and an overlapping bids and rivalry within the sector. And I think before I want to move on as well, the nature of speaking to people on the ground across the region is that some of the complexity around the severe resource restraints that local authorities have faced over the last decade isn't perhaps taken as much as it should be into account. And I would just want to acknowledge that none of this is around or is about local authority bashing. This is hopefully some information that provides an intentionality as to how we can improve the state of play, and also perhaps illustrating some of the opportunity cost of not prioritising investment in culture, arts and heritage, and the need to creatively imagine how we might get round some of the barriers that prevent us doing that at the moment. Our engagement process, I'll run through what we did. We appointed a steering group, a diverse steering group, I might add, people working at all scales across the sector, and they were alongside us throughout this journey. We then commissioned some area representatives, people who knew their local authorities well, knew the creative sector well in them. You can see pictures of them to the right of this screen. We began some exploration chats. We spoke to institutional stakeholders, we spoke to policymakers, we spoke to funders, we spoke to politicians, and we used some of that information to really set the scene for this work. We then ran a series of roundtable events in each local authority, inviting members of the creative sector to come to those roundtables and share with us what's working, what's not. We used the information from those roundtables to inform the questions in our public survey, and we launched that public survey through a series of networks and reached a lot of people through it. Looking at the data from the public survey, we then identified people and organisations we wanted to do more in-depth one-to-one interviews with, and we then held a respondent feedback session. So we invited everybody that had participated in this work to come and hear the voice, I suppose, that was coming through it, and asked them, does this feel right? Do you recognise this? And the result of that was a resounding yes, which was positive. At the beginning of this work, we began to see these emerging value frames, and we've tried to describe them in as simple terms as possible. And when we say, when we talk about the investment, the importance of investing in the sector holistically across value frames, we mean across these three value frames very broadly. So the value of creative output in its own right, the inherent value of beauty, the inherent value of experience, the value of work that is often focused in place and addresses collective problems, isolation, cohesion, applying new thinking and creativity to collective concern. And of course, the value of economic growth, of tourism, of the visitor economy, of business and employment, of GVM. But some summary results from our data. We spoke to and listened to nearly 400 people and organisations. The majority of respondents had a turnover of less than 50k per year. So really speaking to some of those people that often don't get a voice in this sort of process. 15.5% of those respondents started work over the course of the last 2 years. Again, speaking to some of the comments that Ian made about growth in this sector over the pandemic. A large number of respondents identified as working regionally, which is really positive. Respondents identified as working in specific communities and at neighbourhood level. Respondents said that they working in culture, arts and heritage was orientated around strengthening community participation. 32% of respondents identified scaling up and drawing down investment as important. The majority of respondents were in favour of a shared story or narrative for culture, arts and heritage across the region. Respondents clearly identified a lack of funding and funding support as critical to the success of the sector. And to the right of this slide, you can see a map illustrating where responses were coming from, often in urban centres, more in Sheffield, but a good spread across the piece. In our survey, we asked people what keywords or phrases described the perception of the sector now. And as you can see, there were some challenging words used, and the larger the word, of course, the more often it was used in the survey. Fragmented, unfunded, unvalued, growing, innovative, disconnected. But some good stuff in there: passionate, inspiring, ambitious, improving. We then flipped that. We said, what does good sound like? Tell us what good would feel like to you, a more joined up culture, arts and heritage across South Yorkshire. Diverse, connected, community, accessible, funded, collaborative, inclusive, vibrant. And some of these words might give us a sense of what a good narrative for the region, for the sector, might look like. I'm going to speak to some of the conclusions that we drew from this work. And really those are kind of articulations of the voice. And we looked at those across a few different themes. So lack of funding, investment, a failure of cultural leadership, a lack of knowledge and confusion about what SYMCA is, culture, arts and heritage offering this plurality of social and economic innovation, which is so important to align with this strategic economic plan, and that culture, arts and heritage serves place in communities, and then a need for authentic collaboration and a bold set of these narratives for the region and for the sector. At very, very top level, and I mentioned this again earlier, it's symptomatic of the region's failure to value culture, arts and heritage holistically across those three value frames that creates the problems of equity, access to funding, visibility and inclusion within the sector that have been identified by the respondents in this work. So we need to look at the root cause, which is how we are valuing, how we are strategically investing against those value frames if we're to address these symptomatic issues of equity, visibility and inclusion within the sector. So organisations and practitioners would benefit from more access to decision makers. They would benefit from more access to funding. They said that we have failed to recognise how porous and cross-sector and pervasive the impact of the sector is, and that comes out really strongly again in Ian's work. And it speaks to the need to invest in a glue of the conditions that create that. People said that they really benefit from regional interventions which join up infrastructure, capital assets, people and programmes. They benefit from this joined up vision and narrative. They saw the value of SYMCA as a broker and convener for cultural arts and heritage. They named a gap in cultural leadership across the region. They also spoke to an acknowledgement of the lack of capacity to strategically invest in cultural arts and heritage in local authorities. They named that no local authority or funder or institution is engaging effectively with those grassroots organisations, again speaking to some of Ian's final comments earlier. A bit more detail. So in funding and investment, named this lack of available capacity for grant funding and investment. They named the importance of co-creating relationships with funders, a view that large institutions are dominating the funding of strategic decisions across the piece, a view that Sheffield-centric view, availability of resource support. They spoke about a failure of cultural leadership to recognise the value and contribution of the sector, the need for additional capacity in local authorities as to the value of the sector. There was a deficit of representation in cultural leadership across age, ethnicity, gender and disability, and a really overwhelming sense of a lack of visibility, a lack of participation from grassroots organisations, which I think is really important. What and who is SYMCA came out really strongly. What is it? What are its capacities? What are its capabilities? This is a nut that SYMCA, I think, is aware of and knows it needs to crack. But there's a potential for it to be a neutral broker and convener for the region, potential for it to be a thought leader in advocating for culture across its value frames. I want to speak a little bit about the polarity of innovation that's in this sector. This sector regularly is making social and economic innovations. It regularly experiments with different methodologies and approaches. The nature of it is foundationally informed by acts of creativity and innovation which catalyse output across other sectors. It addresses problems of collective concern and creates new value in doing so. It collaborates and permeates across other sectors. The output is consistently drawn on by these other sectors, and again speaks to some of the work that Ian has done as well. Fundamentally, a lot of cultural arts and heritage work, particularly that which operates in place, enables health and wellbeing outcomes, as well as economic growth outcomes. Speaking a bit more about place, it was really clear from speaking to people that cultural arts and heritage work uniquely serves place and communities. And there's a key role for the sector in developing identity and pride in place, and communities and people. There's an acknowledgement that place is where the problems are, which sounds kind of obvious, but we don't talk about it as much. And so organisations and sectors that are engaging in place are also active in solving problems where people are. The importance of accessible and affordable transport in all of that, the importance of enabling people to attend cultural events and so on. There was also an acknowledgement of the importance of establishing and reforming the reputation of place and how cultural arts and heritage play such a central role in that. A lot of our conclusions have come out around this need for authentic collaboration, authentic relationships between people, and the regional narratives that might reflect some of that. And there was an acknowledgement there was a failure of the region to authentically and inclusively engage with cultural organisations and practitioners. That people, again, felt that lack of visibility, that lack of representation in decision making. But there was a desire for co-created narrative, a desire to be more involved in the strategic decision making. People were calling for joined up approaches to culture that was inclusive of grassroots and underserved communities. There was a lot of talk of the patchiness of communications around the section and how that was intrinsic, solving that was intrinsic to joining people up better. The clear need for more diversity in leadership, the need for this an equitable, inclusive gateway through which self-identified creatives and organisations could enter, be recognised, have access to resources and participate in strategic decision making. I'm going to move on to some of the recommendations that we've made as a result of these this engagement and the conclusions that we've drawn. So we made a lot of recommendations, made 40. I'm not going to go through all of them today. They're all in the final report. I've just handpicked a few that I think are good, and then I'll go to 5 steps that I think SYMCA could make off the bat. So investing in the conditions for a thriving culture, arts and heritage sector, what does that look like? It looks like placing culture intentionally and visibly in SYMCA's governance structure and its ambitions, and that's not present currently, but doing so would have a fantastic effect, if only bringing confidence into the sector. We should invest intentionally in all 3 of those value frames as a way of ensuring inclusivity and diversity in the distribution of resource. In some cases, SYMCA isn't a funder, but in some cases, SYMCA should match fund and bring confidence to public funding bodies, named in our initial problem statement. We should fund bespoke training, not generic business support. The sector is unique, its needs are unique, and that might include bid writing, asset-based community development, cross-sectoral matchmaking and mentoring as key components. We should invest in peer-to-peer training from within the sector. The sector has a huge amount of expertise. It's not well supported to share that knowledge, share that experience, and we should invest in peer-to-peer training from within the sector that builds relationships cross-regionally, doubles the impact of that investment. We should broker relationships with local media. We often leave media out, but it's a key part of the sector. We should cultivate collaborations between culture, arts and heritage organisations and other sectoral actors. Lots of people talking about wanting to know more and work with exponential technologies or new material sciences. We should enable organisations and practitioners to use disused spaces in city centres more, cut the red tape as much as possible. And within that, we also need to create more affordable studio spaces, again, investing in those conditions. We need to work out how the sector can hear itself. And there are a range of new digital tools that enable that and that can enable us to hear a more diverse set of voices. And within that, we can create that gateway for self-identified creatives to walk through, form meaningful relationships and have agency and equity in decision making. Deploying financial interventions. Ian mentioned this a little bit earlier as well, but the level of investment that SYMCA should make into this sector should at a minimum match, if not surpass, other MCAs who are now further ahead than where we are. 10.5, 11 million from West Yorkshire, 1% of overall budget from Liverpool gives you a frame for it. We've suggested 15 million over 3 years. We need to invest in the inclusive collaborations and new consortia to create new forms of value. We need to do that across those value frames. We think we should create an independent investment vehicle for all of this work. I think there's a strong argument giving the investment currently from SYMCA and cooperatives and worker-owned organisations that investment vehicle should also be a cooperative or worker or sector owned in some way. I think that would be a really exciting new idea to try. We should focus on removing the barriers to grassroots and freelancers from playing an active role in decision making, and that is an investment choice. And again, we should look at how this vehicle invests in both the social as well as the economic innovations that come out of the sector. I think bold experimentation, distributing learning, especially when we make mistakes. Very little learning comes from success, in my view. Lots of learning comes from making mistakes. We should invest in bespoke training and that peer-to-peer support. Cultural leadership. SYMCA needs to be bold, it needs to be accessible, and it needs to be visible to the sector. It needs to convene a warts and all problem-solving approach which builds relationships across local authorities, across institutional actors, and vertically between grassroots organisations and those institutions. It needs to endorse and support bold experimentation and sharing learning in the sector. It needs to champion and empower underserved voices to show leadership. Speaking to the narrative and coherence, our recommendation is less of a focus on slogans and more of a focus on how we raise up a plurality of stories and identify the common ground and the values between them. We need to speak long-term and multi-generational in the sector. That narrative needs to speak to those needs. The coherence of that narrative, how that narrative sticks in the region, the stickiness, I suppose, that will rest on the relationships that we build between us across the sector. It again emphasises the importance of relationships and how we're doing better relationship building. We also need to think about how that narrative complements and aligns other northern actors. If we're to produce a cultural framework for the region, then we also need to do a regional public engagement exercise. We need that collective buy-in from the members of the public, and we need that sense-making around the value of this work and of this sector. We need to include public funders in that work. It should be co-created with them. We need to facilitate regional annual creative summits. Again, that opportunity for relationships, that opportunity for reputation building, that opportunity for celebrating together. In terms of net zero and the environment, there's a strong role for culture, arts and heritage to better understand the implications of net zero, particularly in place where those organisations and freelancers are often working. And again, an opportunity to back bold experiments in achieving net zero and trying new models out. Education, showing leadership on the relationship between experience of culture and educational attainment. Designing educational interventions and mentoring schemes with the sector, I think, would be really exciting. Sharing legacy and learning. Resourcing schools to take part in culture, arts and heritage experiences across the region. Key component of all of that. I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to wrap up fairly shortly, but these are 5 things that SYMCA could start work on tomorrow. Not do immediately, but start work on. Work on that bold and clear statement about the value that SYMCA sees in this sector and in this work. Name that long-term investment and that catalysation of innovation in the sector. Show how arts and culture sits uniquely in the governance of SYMCA. Convene leaders of local authorities and public funders together for a series of relational meetings centred around this social and economic innovation, the opportunities for the sector and the sharing of problems. Co-create, get everyone involved in understanding those in a warts and all approach. Again, collaborate with local authorities on the large-scale public engagement exercise. Co-design that cultural framework, making sure we're bringing in underserved communities and people, and consider how a digital democracy tools, regional promotion strategy, and that independent investment vehicle sits within that cultural framework. Develop a programme of investment to support peer-to-peer training. Double down on that investment within the expertise that the sector holds. I've got one final slide that I just want to share, which is perhaps a way of thinking about whether investment and strategy was successful. So what lens might we hold up? We might say, did our investment centre underserved people, age groups, communities? We might say, has our investment created the conditions where the plurality of social and economic innovation in culture, arts and heritage can thrive. We might ask, has SYMCA invested in its own voice and reputation as a thought leader and agent of transformational change? Has that thought leadership positioned SYMCA to draw in additional resource for the region, for the sector? Have those interventions been regional, capitalising on that unique position that SYMCA holds in the region? Are the interventions enabling culture and arts and heritage to innovate in wider policy areas? Are we seeing that cross-pollination that's so valuable and such a unique aspect of this sector? Has SYMCA become an inclusive and equitable broker and convener for the region with respect to the plurality of actors and the value frames operating within the sector? I'm going to stop there. Yeah, thanks everyone. I hope that's been useful.
Thanks, James. You said that you couldn't see questions at the time, and there's been quite a lively chat at the time. Which is always we've had a few problems, haven't we, with Teams, but this is one of those things. But one question that we had from Steve Hake was that from your work, it seems that you're suggesting that the combined authority invests internally as well as externally. And what magnitude of investment would you suggest, and what would be a useful outcome? And implicit within that question is, what is the biggest bang for the buck?
I don't think that the work that we have produced would answer the question about the amount of investment required internally for SYMCA. I think the simple fact that the number of people working on culture, arts and heritage within SYMCA is so small tells us something about the need for greater investment, just in terms of people and capacity. I think some of the lenses of success that I've articulated at the end there offer some response to that question. I think that there's a lot of work to be done on voice and narrative and the clarity of that voice and narrative, which will cost money and will require time and investment. And that investment is, by its nature, inwardly focused. I hope that goes some way to answering that question.
Yes, Steve's point about active travel schemes is quite interesting. It could support training, but I'd suggest that needs a degree of collaboration with neighbouring combined authorities as well. So, for instance, one of the places that's crying out for that kind of transport that spans the boundary between West and South Yorkshire is Production Park in Wakefield, where they've got apprenticeship schemes on offer, but people can't take it up because there's no transport after a certain time, and they're working in the production services industry where they need to be able to work late. I'm sure there are other examples of that within South Yorkshire as well, but we need to be thinking more broadly than just networks within. And also, one of the main constraints on growing cultural events is that lack of certainty about being able to get to and from places in the evening. So bus services that stop at 7 and 8 o'clock in the evening effectively kill town centres and kill cultural activity, because you're not going to go out if you can't get back. So those kind of things are actually quite cute strategic interventions that would have a direct impact on the sector. And I think it's an interesting way of looking at it, as well as the head-on approach about what can we invest in businesses and skills.
Fabulous. There's also been a lot of discussion around bid writing, grant writing, and peer-to-peer networks, with some examples being provided by people. I can't see any sort of direct questions within that, but if people would like to ask a question on that, please raise your hands. There was one question from...
Sorry, John, on that. I think there's some learning on peer-to-peer support networks that could be taken actually within the region, but in a different sector. So one absolutely standout organisation who are doing this really well is PFG in Doncaster, and they're doing it within the health system. I think there's some absolutely valuable learning that could be transposed across from that into the creative sector, and I'm sure they would be willing to share that as well. Thanks.
Fabulous. And Vanessa has asked a question in the chat around the proposed funding from the combined authority. Vanessa, would you like to ask that yourself in your own words rather than I'm happy to be your spokesperson?
Well, I'm just basically putting the comment that, as we know in Sheffield, that constantly the Arts Council said that the underfunding in Sheffield is largely part due to lack of local authority investment. Okay, and it's constant. I'm not saying this is across South Yorkshire, because other parts of South Yorkshire invest strategically and greater proportionately in arts and heritage, and have got some great success stories to say about that. And this isn't getting at Sheffield. I'm just asking the question because the universities and other organisations invest heavily in culture, but Arts Council do not include it in their formula. They don't include it. So that's an issue in an area. So is the local authority, is the MCA funding, will that be counted as the same, i.e., you know, we don't count it?
Ian, you might have a view on this, but my understanding is that the way into that question is to start building those relationships better between local authorities and funders and doing that co-creational work, but also pushing that regional narrative and saying, actually, can we do this as a region? And can we look at this work across the piece? I'm not sure how helpful that is, Vanessa, but
I mean, I think there's a need for more transparency from the Arts Council about how they actually perceive local authorities, because one of the things I'd say from the feedback is that perception and reality are quite distant in some places. Certainly Sheffield's lack of financial commitment is commented upon. At this exact moment in time when the Arts Council's announcement of its core national portfolio programme has been pushed back 3 weeks, whilst Jeremy Hunt tries to take £40 billion out of the economy, doesn't seem to make that the absolute overriding priority, as opposed to things that can be done grassroots, peer-to-peer, bottom-up. But yeah, every little helps.
But it's the formula I'm checking about, Ian.
I mean, I don't honestly, I don't think there's any chance in the current climate that the Arts Council is going to relax its formula. It's more likely to cut down on it altogether. We've got absolutely no certainty of what funding might look like from today forward. So I wouldn't hang my hat on it. Is all I'd say.
I suppose the question is, if the MCA is overreaching local authority, surely that could be considered as part of that local authority area. I don't know. Kate can answer.
Yeah, I don't know the answer, but I suppose the encouraging moves are that the Arts Council are talking to MCAs more and more and recognising the fact that we are actors in this. So I think it is about our confidence in building those relationships and, and making the point to the Arts Council that this is a shifting and changing environment where it isn't just dependent on what Sheffield is providing, Sheffield City Council.
And actually that table that I shared at the front is towards that kind of thinking, which is there are many places in which creative industries and cultural arts and heritage are making a contribution which might not be subject to such head-on cuts as direct arts funding. And we need to think about those kinds of alignment as well as potential resource and strength.
And I suppose that's my question. So the question is repeatedly from the Arts Council, I can give you pound, shilling and pence what the university invests directly in funding streams in Sheffield. I know other universities, and this is not included in Arts Council formula. So that's my question. How can we use not to give less money or to talk about it, but it's their formula that is the issue.
Yeah, it's a really important point, Vanessa. I think what we need to continue to lobby to the Arts Council about.
And that's where you get bang for your buck, so that you can demonstrate that this is leveraging more money because it's a direct increase on the formula. And it'd be an interesting correlation to look at. Certain universities have to put more in because the local authority doesn't. So there's an interesting correlation there. it's an interesting national piece of work, Ian, to look at civic universities and local authorities.
I think it's a really interesting point, and also the shift over the last decade in that, and how universities and the very enlightened universities are becoming very supportive in terms of their civic engagement and the sort of direction of travel that that's taking. So I think that is an important piece of research, actually.
Yeah, and also
sorry to cut across. We've also had some other questions here around. I suppose you touched upon it, Ian, a little bit about the political change that we've seen, and really about how thoughts on levelling up, or latterly, what the Northern Powerhouse was. But have I suppose sort of any of the changes, beyond sort of a critique on the funding formula, sort of affected any of your conclusions, really? So yeah, any up-to-date thoughts on that levelling up agenda, really?
I always assume my starting point is always that funding isn't available, and that the mechanisms that creative industries need to use can be served from other places. That's not true of culture, and it's a mixed economy. So one of the things that we need to square is what the balance between the for-profit and not-for-profit is, and to understand that, I think there's a really strong point around devolution more generally. As I said, Whitehall is really bad at allocating resource for creative industries and culture outside London, partly because it assumes that the composition of the sector is the same across the UK, which it isn't. So I think that doing what Kate's doing at the moment and joining in with that Northern Powerhouse discussion about how can we effectively demonstrate that we can spend the money more effectively, more locally, is the most promising starting point in a time when we know that all the actual total budgets are going to be nailed down. It's not necessarily getting more, it's doing more. It's being able to have some of the flexibility that Vanessa's talking about, and being allowed to do more with what we've already got.
James, any comments on that? No. Great. There's not a question, but an FYI on sort of ideas around creative improvement districts, and useful sort of insights there that Ian's posted in the chat. I'm sure we'll be following up on that. Steve, thank you for asking my favourite question, which is, can we get copies of the slides? Yes, we will circulate that. If others have questions around this, around what has been presented today, please let me know. I'm sort of flying through quite a lot of discussion in the chat, which is great. It shows the engagement and importance. There was quite a lot of discussion around, I suppose, sort of some of the skills and employment interventions, really. So that I suppose sort of peer-to-peer training, the issue around bid writing, grant development training that is missing. So that's sort of specific area, and I think that is something that is well within the capabilities. Is there anywhere that you feel is doing this particularly well, and that's sort of feeding through into the sector, showing that they're sort of punching above their weight?
I think there's some really good distinctive place-based models in South Yorkshire. The ways in which different authorities have approached the COVID grants for freelancers and small creative businesses, for instance, they were really tailored to the situation in place. And that's also, Polly's picked up on that point. The local authorities need support to see creative industries in the round as part of social value and impact, not as another industrial sector that needs support. Viewed that way, it's much easier to understand how it complements and sits alongside their statutory duties, rather than becoming another awkward non-statutory drain on the budget. I'm not saying, again, that we shouldn't have any arts funding, but I'm saying in a situation where that's difficult, there is probably twice as much leverage in the statutory duties as there is in dedicated arts funding.
Yeah, I guess the thing I'd add to that is, particularly with fundraising, so much of it is based on your relationship with funders and your knowledge of how funders operate, as much as it is writing a good bid. And so really we need to think about how are we distributing learning that the sector already has more equitably across the sector. What's the mechanism for that? It's not so much that there are, great examples of people doing great fundraising. Of course there are, but it's more the question of how you distribute that knowledge across the sector, in my view.
Yes, excellent. Again, there's been a lot of discussion, so some really good points around, and I suppose sort of further cementing some of the points that Ian and James have made. So indirect investment, really important about leveraging that from the public sector. Important that the combined authority keeps engaged with DCMS work streams, but also works together with M10 other combined authorities on sets of principles, specific sector alignment, so the health sector looking at sort of space around alignment and recognition within the NHS to invest and benefit. Julie's got a question as to where should creatives go at the moment for business support and creative coaching.
And I was just about to start typing them. It varies sector by sector. So there are things like Screen Yorkshire and Music Launchpad. If you're in those sectors, it depends very much what we mean by what's creative and what does business support constitute for them, whether it's actually formal business support in the way that Team South Yorkshire would look at through Scale Up, or whether it's more peer-to-peer based thing. And again, Jem has highlighted the fact that the local authorities are doing things, and I think what we've observed through the year that we've been working on this is the local authorities are trying to pick up the threads of that support in different ways through programs that they already have. And again, that's part of the work of the task force of how do we pull those offers together and make them available in one place, if you like, because I think visibility is as much of an issue as actual availability.
And just within time, there's been a question about UK SPF. I can direct that question to my colleague here, but it's safe to say no monies have sort of landed in any accounts yet. So the SPF is very much still a live debate. Or rather, there's been a plan submitted to government, and we're awaiting the outcome of that. So I can direct that query to a colleague who'll pick that up. What I wanted to do though is thank James and Ian and everyone on the call for participating and contributing today. Thank you so much, James, Ian. If there was a round of applause, a virtual round of applause, you'd be sort of receiving that. You'd be basking in that glory, and in the rest of the day, you'd be feeling very warm and glowing about that. So thank you so much for running us through that. I've been sort of I'm close to the work, but I found that really enthralling, and I'm sure colleagues will do. We'll circulate the slides. We'll circulate discussion, and any further questions, please send them through to myself or colleagues on here. But thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Cheers.
Very helpful, thank you. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.